Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Pocono Mountains Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Hamill. We've traveled throughout the Poconos over these past few podcasts and met some really instrumental people in the region, both current day and from the past. Learning so much about these towns throughout the Poconos has been a great way to find out things you might have never known about Jim Thorpe, Milford, or any of the unique places here in the 4 counties that make up the Pocono Mountains. Now, for another location on the map that has an amazing history and an equally wonderful charm today, Delaware Water Gap. Yes, the Delaware Water Gap is a natural formation where the river carved out a passage between 2 mountains. It's also the name for the national park that stretches from Milford to Stroudsburg along the river on both sides. And it's also the name of the borough that is rich with history, whether it be the early days of the Pocono resorts, or even jazz, or hiking the Appalachian Trail. Delaware Water Gap is just off Interstate 80 when you cross into Pennsylvania, and Route 611 takes you right through the downtown, which has shops and restaurants, outdoor outfitters, and historic landmark properties. In just a moment, we'll hear from Professor Martin Wilson from East Stroudsburg University about what makes Delaware Water Gap such a cool spot in the Poconos. The Poconos is a year-round destination for millions, with 2,400 square miles of mountains, forests, lakes, and rivers. With historic downtowns and iconic family resorts, it's the perfect getaway for a weekend or an entire week. You can always find out more on PoconoMountains.com or watch Pocono Television Network streaming live 24/7. Thanks for listening to Pocono Mountains Podcast. We'll have a new episode each week highlighting lots of fun things you can experience while you're visiting the Poconos here in Pennsylvania. Subscribe to Pocono Mountains Podcast and leave a review and comment if you would, please, on whatever platform you listen. Now for Chris Barrett and Dr. Wilson from an episode of Pocono Perspectives.
So we're here with Dr. Martin Wilson. He is a history professor at East Stroudsburg University. We're here to have a conversation about the Delaware Water Gap and the importance of it to the Poconos. Marty, why the name Delaware Water Gap? Like, where did that name come from?
Well, I think, again, from the geological formation. You know, you got the Delaware River, hence Delaware, water, the river, going through this gap in the mountains. And it's, it's an unusual geological formation. So I assume that's where the name came from. I don't know anything other than that concerning the name.
So who were the earliest settlers that kind of, for lack of a better term, discovered it?
Well, the Minnesink, which is that area north of the Delaware Water Gap along the river, was a fairly active Lenni Lenape settlement. The first Europeans to come into the area were probably the 1650s. They came down from the Hudson River because that was part of New Netherlands. You know, New Amsterdam was founded in 1620s along the Hudson River. So the people into the area came down, first Europeans into the area came down from the Hudson River, and they saw Indians wearing copper trinkets. And so they found out where the copper came from, and that drew them to this area. You know about the copper mines over in New Jersey?
Yeah, and weren't they were actually mined for about 30 or 40 years, correct?
Yeah. The history of the mines, I'm not real clear if they were mined for a while and then they were closed down, and then somebody else tried to open it up later and it didn't work out. I'm not sure exactly.
So some of the actions of that infrastructure are still even there, correct?
Yeah,
some pieces of it. So is this when Duteau actually came to the region?
No, Duteau didn't come until 1793. What happened is, Duteau was from what we call Haiti today. It's the western third of the island of Hispaniola, which was a French colony. They grew sugar mostly, but coffee and other things. Anyway, 1791, the slaves rose up in rebellion and started slaughtering every white person they could find. Duteau, we know, was a plantation owner, but we don't know how many. We don't even know if he owned slaves, to be quite frank, but he probably did. So anyway, he fled, came to Philadelphia. The story goes he ran into Stephen Girard. Stephen Girard had contacts with that island because he was a trader. And Stephen Girard said, well, you ought to head north. 1793, by the way, there was a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. It would make sense to me that if a guy like Duteau, who's a young man at that point, probably had some money, it would make sense. The reason why he didn't stay in Philadelphia in 1793 was because of the yellow fever epidemic. Anyway, he comes north and he buys the land just above the water gap along the river there. So that's 1793 when Duteau came.
So what was his, what did he really do here in 1793? Was there a reason why he came here? Did he see opportunity?
He wanted to build a town on the river. Now, I've always heard it referred to as an inland city. I don't know, city, big word, city, you know. But he wanted to build this inland town, and he actually built a number of buildings, and he set aside a little triangle piece of ground for a square. The thing is, you know, the area had already been kind of settled. I mean, the Broadheads were already here, Depew was already here, 1720s. So people had been around for decades at that point. But nobody had really settled right on the river. And I often thought Duteau saw that as an opportunity because the rivers were the highways of the time.
Right.
You know? So I'm thinking, you want to have connection to Philadelphia, you want to be close to the river. So anyway, he came and he didn't know how to make a living here. So he looked for minerals. Maybe there's something in the mountains that you can mine. Didn't have any luck with that. He was running through any money that he had brought with him, but he's looking around at the scenery and he's thinking, this might be my meal ticket, right? Maybe I can make some money by bringing tourists into the area and to enjoy this. So he starts building the Kittatinny House, what later becomes the Kittatinny House. He ran out of money, sold it to a guy named Samuel Snyder in 1832, and then Snyder opened it up as the Kittatinny, and that starts the resort industry really in the Poconos.
So really kind of that's when the Delaware water gap started to grow. And
well, I think if you think of the Poconos as a resort destination, it starts in Delaware Water Gap. That's you know, I think of that as the epicenter, Delaware Water Gap. That's where the first big hotels were, and all the other hotels sprung up after that.
so the bigger hotels that were in Delaware water gap, what were they?
Well, the Kittatinny was the biggest, and then the Water Gap House, which up on top of the hill behind it, was another huge hotel. And then the Castle Inn, which still stands today, came along much later. Those and the Glenwood, those were probably the four biggest. And the Glenwood still stands. That's a brick building. The reason the Castle Inn still stands is because it's a cement building. The only one of the hotels that still stands that was wood is the Deerhead Inn itself, which was the central house back then.
We were talking a little bit about anthracite in this overall region.
Yeah.
So how do you feel anthracite really helped or detracted from this region because it's so close, being Hazleton being so close and
Yeah.
not that far away, in Carbon County, of course. We had touched a little bit on anthracite, but it's interesting about how that whole way of life just blossomed here, of course, with the material here.
Well, you know, the history of the anthracite region is a fascinating history. You told me you grew up in Hazleton. If I were to connect this area to the anthracite region, I would say that it was a place where immigrants who were looking for jobs in the anthracite region, they got off the boat in New York and they came on the train through this region. And they went to the anthracite region, and the reason that this region developed was because of the railroad, which was created because of the anthracite industry.
I think I found, we were doing some research and we found the life of Asa Packer very fascinating, that in this same time period, that he was one of the richest men in America, along with the Vanderbilts and some of the other names that would come up. He was actually in the top 5 of the richest people in the United States and left quite a legacy, but yet he's fairly unknown.
Well, of course, Lehigh University, Asa Packer, the whole thing,
Right.
he built it, and the Asa
Right.
Packer auditorium or whatever it is. But he made his money just transporting the coal, you know, and that's where you made your money in anthracite, by transporting
Right.
it, not by mining it.
Right. In your estimation, what were the heyday years? What were the golden years?
I would say the heyday was maybe 1870s up through the 19-teens, something like that. The railroad was the key to Delaware Water Gap. Once cars come along in great numbers after the 20s and then into the 1930s, the heyday of Water Gap's passed. You know, it's moved on to other parts of the Poconos, but Water Gap never recovered from it.
And I had read that a lot of the larger properties that are like the Kittatinny Inn actually burned down and were never rebuilt.
Yeah, you have to remember something, Chris. Those were all summer-only hotels. They closed down in the fall. I think it's coincidental that it was November of 1915 that the Water Gap House burned down. So at the end of the season, They're closing it down. It was October, I think, I might have the months incorrect or reversed, but 1931 that the Kittatinny burned down. So both, again, at the end of the season. Yeah, so those two hotels, once they burned down, you know, it's especially the Kittatinny, it's the Depression, you know.
So they weren't going to be rebuilt. It was right at the start of the...
It's the Depression, and cars now are plentiful, and people don't need to stay at those big hotels. And you know, another thing that changed, Chris, is people used to take vacations for the season. You know, people from New York, it's hard for us to imagine what life must have been like before air conditioning, you know?
And we talked about that, or we were talking about that a little bit before we actually came on here, but why would people want to leave the cities, I guess was probably the first thing I should ask. And was it because there was no air conditioning in the cities? They weren't sanitary? Is that one of the reasons?
You can imagine 95-degree heat in New York City with garbage strewn, and keep in mind that the streets were still not paved, lots and lots of horses, as many as 100,000 horses as late as 19 teens. It was a dirty, smelly, uncomfortable place to be. So people that could afford it would just ship the whole family off to a place like the Kittatinny for the season. And the father would come out on Friday night on the train and go back Monday morning to the city to work, leaving the family out here.
So the father, what type of occupation would that father have had?
Yeah, well, they would not have been working class, certainly. They would have been, and they wouldn't have been the upper classes either, because the upper classes went to Bar Harbor and they had their own places. But let's call them upper middle class, so lawyers, middle management, those kinds of things.
So it was an up-and-coming kind of destination?
Yes.
And we talked about this a little bit too, how did they make reservations before the phone and the telegraph?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. The telegraph existed, certainly, and the telegraph always followed the rail lines, and there was a telegraph office in Delaware Water Gap, but I've never read anything about that. Of course, they could have written letters, and I suspect that's mostly how it was done.
I was reading on your website the history of Delaware Water Gap, and one of the things that was really, really interesting was that there were some newspapers that published the guest lists, which I thought was interesting. Why was that?
You wanted to know who was in town. I mean, it's not the kind of vacationing that we do today, you know? You wanted to know who was in town. You wanted to know if you met the people that you met 2 years ago were in town. So it was a different thing than it is today. I can't imagine that kind of a thing happening at a place like this.
So at the heyday that you just described and outlined for us, what would be some of the things that a family would do? That they're staying there the whole summer. So what would be the activities that they would engage in throughout that 3 or 4 month period?
Okay, well, let's start low and work up. Low meaning the river. I mean, they're going to certainly spend time at the river. They're going to swim in the river. They're going to boat on the river. So there are a lot of waterborne activities. There were lots of trails, and they still exist in Delaware Water Gap. Part of the Appalachian Trail is on these trails. They would go out and contemplate nature. They would sit on the verandas of those big old hotels with these beautiful views. You know, one thing that intrigues me about those vacationers is whenever you see photographs of them, they're dressed to the nines, you know? The women have long dresses on and blouses, and the men have suits and ties and hats. And I'm talking about up in the woods, so they're hiking in that kind of clothing. So I think for them, coming out of the city, this was a big deal. They want to show that they've sort of made it into the upper middle class, or middle class at least, and that's the way you dress. This is a big deal, going out, and they didn't drink a lot. You know, it depends on the time period, but there weren't many hotels that had alcohol at the time, in the 1870s, 1880s. Later on they did. But I think part of why they came was nature. I mean, they're coming from an urban area. Their lives are tied up in urban, and they come out here and they see trees and they see I think it was just a religious experience for them. And I mean that in the sense that urbanites, it's easy to imagine that urbanites saw when they came out to nature the hand of God, that kind of thing. So I think it was almost, it sounds silly to say, but sort of serious business for them, this vacationing stuff.
So if one of these families stayed at the Kittatinny Inn for the summer, How much would something like that cost?
That's a good question. I have seen the rates. Depends on the years, maybe $5 a week per person.
Did that include meals?
Yeah, that would include meals. They all advertised, milk from cows that we have on the grounds, vegetables that we grow in our own farm.
That was fascinating.
Yeah.
One of the things I saw in your write-up was it wasn't termed this way, but it was very early farm to table. Like right now we have a lot of resorts that really say, hey, we have farm to table, it's locally sourced. Well, that was happening then.
Yes, it was, yeah. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know what it would have cost them. I can't imagine it was very expensive though, but.
So now the city, or the town itself of Delaware Water Gap, what was that like when the resorts were in full operation, say in June and July?
Yeah.
How about the people who live there? How did they feel about the Delaware Water?
Yes, well, you're talking about a town of maybe 700 people, depending, right? And then at the height of the season, maybe 2,500 people in the town. On a nice day, the streets of that tiny little borough were packed with people walking up and down. The local people, I have never read anything suggesting they resented these people coming in. As a matter of fact, they made their living from these people, a lot of them. There was a guy named Casey Drake. Casey grew up he was born in 1903. He grew up in Water Gap. And he told me before he died, we used to talk a lot about this. He died when he was in his late 80s, several years ago, but his family lived in a little house that still exists on Oak Street. And in the summertime, they would rent out their house and live in a tent in the backyard. They would rent it out to people from New York City who came up there and rented the house for the entire summer. Their name was the Hammer family from New York City. They were importers and exporters. The Hammer family later built a house in Delaware Water Gap, which coincidentally I happen to own. It's where I live right now.
That's interesting.
But Casey tells the story about how his mom took in laundry from these guests at the hotels, at the Kittatinny and the Water Gap house. And the first summer they did it, now picture this, they're living in a tent in the backyard and there's just grass on it. It's not, it's just a tent. And it rained the whole summer. And his poor mom's doing this laundry in this tent and hanging it up, trying to get it to dry.
Wow.
Inside the tent.
Wow.
But, that they made their living from, a lot of them made a good part of their living from the hotel guests.
So they were very entrepreneurial back then.
Sure.
Wow.
Oh, and another thing, he rented out, his father rented out the whole house, but people would put, if they had a room, they would rent it out. I mean, we always talk about the big hotels, but a lot of people would just rent out a room. Kind of like a B&B, I guess, like today. But.
I mean, it's people think it's a new concept, but apparently it really wasn't. As the decline started, how did the population of the town go down? And I saw one comment that you had made. It seemed like the folks at Delaware Water Gap were kind of content to let that era pass them by and let the Poconos kind of really start to resurge as a resort area.
Yeah, I think one of the saving graces of the town of Delaware Water Gap, from my perspective, because I live there and I love the town, is that it never developed. Once cars came along and the railroad was not as critical for bringing guests, the tourism industry spread out around the Poconos more. The town of Water Gap went through decades of sort of decline. There wasn't a whole lot going on there, but it became this very nice kind of community that's limited by space geographically. So we can never have like big, huge hotels there anymore or things like this, which I think the people that live in Water Gap are happy about. It's become more or less a sort of a bedroom community for Stroudsburg, sort of a suburb for Stroudsburg, if that makes sense. And of course, a lot of people live and work in New York City, live there and work in New York City.
I think one of the things that we talked about that was very interesting is how did the Delaware Water Gap, the federal management the recreation area, how did that happen now? Because that's part of the history too.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say this. The Delaware Water Gap is that geological formation. When the railroad comes through, the town of Dutowsburg, named after Antoine Dutow, changed their name to capitalize on it because people in New York City knew it. So now we fast forward 100 years or whatever it is, and The Army Corps of Engineers is going to build a dam across the Delaware River about 3 miles north of Shawnee at a place called Tox Island. And they're going to back up the water all the way up the Delaware Valley to Milford, a 30-some mile long lake. They bought up all the land, kicked people off, incurring lifelong anger against the Park Service that still exists to this day. And people started to protest. A lot of different people from a lot of different angles. It's kind of a complex story, but the long and short of it is that they ended up not building the dam. Now they have this land that they had kind of set aside for recreation anyway. It was one of the things that the Tox Island Dam was going to provide, recreation. So they just turned it into a national recreation area. So for you and I, that's a good thing because, you know, as I was saying earlier, we get to use it. If it was still in private hands, you know as well as I do, there'd be condominiums up and down that river, at least in parts. So the National Recreation Area came about because of this failed Tox Island.
And thousands of people enjoy it every year.
And people, yes, right. I think I read somewhere it's one of the most visited because it's so close to New York City and Philadelphia.
Yeah, it's incredible. One thing is Duto Museum. Can you talk just a little bit about that before we go?
Yes, the Duto Museum was it's in a school that was built in the 1800s. I don't have the exact date. Let's say 1850s, something like that. It was a 4-room schoolhouse, and it closed in 1969. My cousin, who's a year younger than me, went there. That year, a group of local citizens from Water Gap formed the SOS Save Our School Committee, and they petitioned the school board to give it to the borough for $1 or something like that. And then the SOS committee decided to use it for community betterment. At one point there was a library in there. They always had talk about putting a museum in, bringing artifacts in. So it's kind of morphed from that into the Duto Museum. Upstairs we have 2 rooms dedicated to the museum, the history of the resorts. And downstairs we have a revolving art show every summer. Now the Duto Museum is only open, from May to October. It's only in the summertime, and it's all volunteer. But it's a very active museum. We have a very active group of people involved in that museum.
Well, we want to encourage everyone to visit that. We were very lucky today to have Marty Wilson, Dr. Wilson, history professor at East Stroudsburg University, to tell us a little bit about the Delaware Water Gap and some of the great history of the Pocono Mountains. I'm Chris Barrett for Dr. Wilson for Pocono Perspectives. Thanks for watching.
There's no one better to share that history of Delaware Water Gap than a history professor. Our thanks to Dr. Marty Wilson for sitting down with Chris Barrett. Thanks again for listening to Pocono Mountains Podcast. You can subscribe to us anywhere podcasts are available and leave a review and or comment. For more information, just head to PoconoMountains.com.
It's my passion to be around people, to be serving people.
What I would say to others looking to get in the hospitality industry would be to do it. It's a great experience.
I had the opportunity to meet such amazing people from different places.
It's all about the experience and the memories we're creating for our guests, for our visitors.
Pocono hospitality, it's not just our job, it's our passion and our way of life.
Now for a Pocono Mountains Podcast Extra. Speaking of Delaware Water Gap, we recently released a video about the town and many of the aspects that makes it so rich within the music scene, hiking, as well as the beauty in and around the Delaware Water Gap. We hope you enjoy this snippet of that video, and you can find it on Pocono Television Network, as well as PoconoMountains.com, and at Pocono Tourism, our YouTube channel as well.
When people think about the Poconos now as a vacation destination, they have to pass through Delaware Water Gap. We're really the gateway into the Poconos.
It's the feature itself, Mount Tammany on one side, Mount Minzy on our side. The beauty of the gap and the fresh air out here that encourage people to come from New York City and Philadelphia and spend the whole summer here. We were the first resort area in the Poconos.
Word got out, and then the town decided this is a pretty beautiful place. A lot of people are coming here. Let's change it up a little bit. They built a lot of hotels.
Most of our relatives worked in those resorts, and they helped take care of other people's families while they were up here on vacation. And I think that just carried through. It was built on the prospect of making people feel like home. We're a very hospitable town. Because of it being a resort town for so long, it employed thousands of local musicians. It built this community of musicians basically from all over the world.
We used to talk about the places of the harmonic convergence, the very Aquarian, 60s kind of idea. Places where the cosmic powers come together. And this always seemed to be like one of those places.
One day some guy will come in and he'll be amazing. And I'll be like, where'd he come from? And then sticks around for a while, plays some beautiful music, and then moves on, and somebody else pops up.
It was an open forum. They did jam nights, and all the musicians would stop there at the Deer Head.
It is the oldest continuously running jazz club in the country, by the way. And we hope somebody disputes that, and there's a big lawsuit, so we'll get some free publicity. Some of the musicians were sitting around having a few pops, and they decided, we can't wait to sit in. There's too many of us, and there's only one piano player.
They said, let's do this outside once a year. And they created this really small jazz festival that then grew to be thousands of people.
The Appalachian Trail brings hikers through. Hikers are an interesting lot. They're free spirits. They go to the Deer Head, they go to the Sycamore, they go down to the Village Farm, and they participate in the community. When they're here, they stay at the Church of the Mountain. There's a hostel over there, free for them to stay, or they throw their tents over there at the church.
It's the only hostel that has towel service for the hikers. They literally, the members come and gather up the dirty towels, bring clean towels, and have it there for them.
They make it a point to stop. They also try and time it for Thursday nights when we have our hikers' dinner. Everybody makes a dish and brings it.
And this huge porch on Thursdays is absolutely filled with people. We hear the hikers' stories, but then we hear each other's stories from the week.
My mom was a bus stop lady. My father was chief of police for 20 plus years. My brother was the fire chief, probably 20 plus years. My family, my father especially, if he saw somebody that was in need of a hot meal or something, they would bring them to the house and my mom would cook a hot meal for them. You can always count on your neighbor. Always, always, always count on your neighbor.
Anything that we've accomplished, that attitude is just overflowing.
And it makes me feel like everybody's mom, kind of. It's not a funny thing to say, but we're all related. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter any of that. Once you get here, we're all related. And we need help. If you have a museum, if you have a church, if you have hikers, if you have all these things, you need help. You need volunteers. This is what it is to be in water gapping.
I love when we're driving people to the river. You have that chatter in the van and people are laughing and they're really excited, but they're a little nervous too. And then you pull in to one of the most beautiful places and you say, okay guys, we're here. And they're like, wow, this is amazing. Fantastic time for paddling right now. The colors are alive and the river's low and slow and clear and warm.
I never get over the beauty of this area. That drive from here down to the point of the gap is just one of the most spectacular drives. Every chance I get, I take that road. It's just so beautiful.
It's just a gift to live like this and to know how it feels to be connected to a community.
Yeah, there's a harmony in this town. And if you get inside it a little bit, you like to keep that going. That's a good feeling.
I love my home. I love my business here. I love the people that come into my business. I wouldn't change it for the world.
Welcome to the Delaware Water Gap.
Again, you can catch that amazing video wherever you can watch PTN, the Pocono Television Network. We hope you enjoyed Pocono Mountains podcast. Please remember to subscribe wherever podcasts are available. Come visit us in the Pocono Mountains. Book your trip today.